Hello, it's 9 p.m. here in the French capital. Let's get you up to date with our headlines. Fresh clashes between anti-government protesters and the police in Venezuela after a day of protesting that left 3 dead. We'll be talking to our correspondent in Caracas. Harsh words exchanged between Iran and the US over the nuclear deal as the Trump administration pays a visit to Iran's regional rivals. And France's 11 presidential candidates face journalists in a new style of live TV show, just 3 days before the first round of voting. We'll be bringing you the latest in our continuous campaign coverage. This is today's Live from Paris with me, Belle Lupton. We've been hearing reports that clashes have erupted between protesters against Venezuela's president and the police. Protesters have gone back into the streets despite 3 deaths in yesterday's demonstrations. Earlier, the chief prosecutor said a National Guard sergeant was killed in a gunfire attack while his squad was trying to control protesters in a city near Caracas. 2 others, including a teenage student, were also killed. Protesters blame pro-government groups for their deaths. In all, 8 have been killed in demonstrations over the past few weeks in Venezuela. I'm joined now on the line by Anatoly Kurmanaev, a Wall Street journalist, who is in Caracas. Anatoly, have today's protests been as big as yesterday's? I mean, yesterday's were called the mother of all protests.
That's right, yeah. Today perhaps would be a niece of a protest. Still sizable turnout from your position today. Several thousand people congregating in eastern Caracas, maybe up to 10,000. Quite surprising determination given the scale of violence and repression we've seen yesterday. But what's been different today is the geography of a protest. Once again, the protesters have congregated in the eastern part of Caracas, the opposition-controlled boroughs, and as they tried to march on the downtown, they were met with tear gas and rubber bullets by the police. So a similar pattern that we've seen in the last few days playing out again today in Caracas, but still shows the opposition is undeterred despite the violence.
And what does this renewed attempt at protest tell us about the opposition's strategy? They've chosen this sort of daily street protest to go for.
That's right. Well, the opposition leaders believe that there has to be a multi-pronged approach to forcing Mr. Maduro to hold election. Street pressure is one of them, but they also believe in strong international lobbying and behind-the-door negotiations with government officials, military officers, judges, etc. As we speak, an opposition leader is meeting with Colombian President Santos, next door to Venezuela, a very important country for Venezuela. Also very strong condemnations from the Secretary General of OAS today about the deaths of protests yesterday from other governments around the region. So the pressure on Maduro is certainly building. The big question is that can the opposition maintain this pressure in the face of exhaustion and fear among its protesters?
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for now. Thank you very much, Anatoly Kurmanaev in Caracas for us there. The US should fulfill its own commitments rather than making accusations against Iran. That's what Iran's foreign minister tweeted earlier. Javad Zarif was responding to the US Secretary of State, who accused Iran of alarming ongoing provocations aimed at destabilising the Middle East and undermining America's interests. But Rex Tillerson admitted that the Islamic Republic has remained compliant with a nuclear deal signed in 2015. So why does the US want to review that deal? Sharon Gaffney explains. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now from Washington, D.C. by Reza Marashi, Research Director at the National Iranian-American Council. Mr. Marashi, during his campaign, Trump called this the worst deal ever negotiated. But it was a deal that was negotiated above US party political lines. Do you think Trump is reducing, or is at danger of reducing, one of the most important nuclear non-proliferation agreements to be signed to national party politics?
I think that's exactly what's happening. And American presidents are only as smart as the people that he or she surround themselves with. And the majority of foreign policy and national security officials surrounding Donald Trump have long track records of opposing diplomacy with Iran more generally and opposing the Iran nuclear deal more specifically. So really, this shouldn't come as a surprise, but it is a big deal, and it's definitely the right thing to be talking about right now, because the alternative to the deal is military confrontation that nobody wants.
Well, and it's quite normal for incoming administrations to review policy. So Obama, for instance, did the same for the Iran policy in 2009. How is this different?
Well, it's funny you mention that. I was at the State Department in the Office of Iranian Affairs in 2009. I was there for that review. But that was a review of Iran policy broadly conceived. The Trump administration has said that they are specifically reviewing the Iran deal, which makes no practical sense from a national security or foreign policy perspective, because everybody who put together the Iran deal, the vast majority of which, who put together the Iran deal in the U.S. government are career government officials. They were not Obama political appointees. So the same people that ostensibly would be doing it for Trump did it for Obama. The difference is that Trump has those people surrounding him in the White House that are political appointees that have never supported the deal at all from the beginning until now.
Well, Trump himself admits that Iran has been upholding its end of the bargain in that nuclear agreement. That sort of makes it harder for him to launch a full frontal attack on the deal, doesn't it?
Well, you're absolutely right to point out that it does. But I do think that there is at least a certain degree of savviness in this White House, where they know that they don't want to walk away from the deal or just kill the deal outright, because then that makes it look like the problem is in Washington rather than in Tehran. So instead, there is going to probably be a short to medium-term compliance on America's end, while trying to really push back against Iran regionally, make things more difficult on the sanctions-related front, and goad the Iranians into walking away from the deal so that Tehran can be blamed.
What sort of, could you elaborate on that a little bit? I mean, what sort of measures might we see from the US to try and push Iran into being the ones that break the deal first?
I think the most likely scenario is that the United States has full control over determining what compliance and non-compliance means over every aspect of this nuclear deal. That language is literally written into the JCPOA, as it's called. So if they have a more strict interpretation than the Obama administration did, they can turn the screws on Iran. Another way they could potentially do it is congressional legislation coming out of the Senate is proposing to re-sanction Iran, things that used to be sanctioned on Iran's nuclear program being introduced under the auspices of terrorism or human rights. That also is specifically written into the deal as a violation. And if Trump doesn't veto those sanctions, America would be violating the deal.
Great to have your analysis on this, Reza Marashi. Thank you very much, Reza Marashi, the Research Director at the National Iranian-American Council. Well, the countdown is well and truly on here in France. With just 3 days until voters go to the polls for the first round in the presidential election, 30% of them still haven't made up their mind who they're going to vote for. And for gamblers across the channel in the UK, that makes it a pretty exciting bet. Pierre Delrieux reports on how British bookmakers are cashing in on the French elections. Well, with 30% of voters still undecided and just 3 days before that first round of voting, should we be looking to the bookmakers rather than the pollsters for an idea of how this election is going to pan out? Some of those undecided voters might have a better idea in a few hours' time, because the 11 candidates are right now on television, French television, being quizzed by journalists. Well, earlier I spoke to Arti Shankar, a policy analyst at the think tank Open Europe. I started by asking her whether this new style of TV show for the candidates is better than a debate for voters.
This is a new style that we're seeing in this third and final election debate. Each of the 11 candidates are going to get about 15 minutes to talk one-on-one, roughly speaking, with the journalists. Now, one of the reasons for this change in format was actually the threat that some pretty central candidates would not take part in another 11-part open debate and preferred a different format. But as you say, 3 days away from the first round of the elections, I expect that the TV platform also thought one of the vital aspects of this election debate must equally be for the public to be able to take away a real message from each of the candidates.
Well, and France 2, who are the organisers of this debate, they've said that tonight's show is not going to be about political spectacle, as some of the former debates have been, but more about the nitty-gritty of policy. That doesn't stop this from being a last-minute opportunity for each of the candidates to try and wow the viewers at home, though, does it? And also from the press from identifying a winner. What effect do you think this might have just under 3 days before the polls open here in France?
Well, if we look at the polls as they currently stand, we are looking at 4 candidates who are very, very close to one another, within mere percentage points. So usually we talk about, as you say, in these election debates, who came out on top, or equally who has most to lose. And ordinarily in the previous debates, it has been the frontrunners, Emmanuel Macron, the centrist candidate, and Front National leader Marine Le Pen, who have been mooted as those having the most to lose. And that may well still be the case. Polls still put them ahead in the lead, but they only have a few percentage point lead. And what we're seeing is that with 4 candidates coming up within a hair's breadth of each other, the real question for these debates has to be who is going to stand out.
Italy's highest court of appeal has begun hearing the case of the captain of the Costa Concordia cruise ship that sank in 2012, leaving 32 people dead. Francesco Schettino is hoping to reduce his 16-year jail sentence, but Italian prosecutors are calling on the court to drive home a guilty verdict. Pierre Delrieux has more. And now, Charles Darwin marvelled at their majestic prehistoric look when he first visited the Galapagos Islands in the 19th century. Yes, I'm talking about giant tortoises. Well, these endangered species can move an absolute maximum of 2 kilometres a day, but around 30 of them have now been found a long way from their home in Ecuador. Wildlife police found the giant creatures in a bus in northern Peru. As you can see there, they were wrapped up in tape to try and make it easier for them to travel. It's thought they were on their way to being sold on the black market in Europe. 2 of them died during the voyage, but the survivors have been taken to the nearest zoo for medical attention. They'll be finding their way safely back to Ecuador, where they can be looked after properly. It's time now for business. I'm joined in the studio by Brian Quinn again. Hello, Brian.
Hi, Bill.
And we're starting with the oil markets, an optimistic outlook, for the global economic picture in 2017.
Both a little bit, actually, not so much oil. But the International Monetary Fund is predicting that the world economy as a whole will grow 3.5% in 2017. Back to you, Bill.
Brian, thank you very much for the roundup of the business. And we're just going to bring you some breaking news that you've probably been seeing ticking along the bottom of your screens there. We're hearing reports of a shooting incident in central Paris. This is from police sources. So far, 1 police officer we have has been killed, another second police officer wounded. All this took place in a shooting attack in the Champs-Élysées in central Paris. Again, I stress these are police reports that are just coming into us now. The gunman responsible for these attacks is said to have been killed. That's according to the police. We will, of course, be bringing you more on that when we come back after this short break.
The French will elect a new head of state on April 23rd and May 7th.